She was deaf. She was a nurse. And deep inside the forest surrounding Caldwell City, she watched 12 armed men load weapons into a van while federal agents conducted a major investigation less than 2 miles away. No one believed her when she ran out of those woods, bleeding and breathless. No one listened when she described what she had seen. They looked at her the way they always did, like someone who didn't understand how the world actually worked. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. This story already has you locked in. Hit that subscribe button and follow this channel so you don't miss a single part. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city are you watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift ended at 11:47 p.m., which was 13 minutes later than it should have, because Dr. Harlan Voss had decided at the last possible moment that Maya Arden's discharge notes on a post-op patient needed to be redone entirely. "These are incomplete," he said, not looking up from the chart. Maya watched his lips. She'd been reading lips since she was 4 years old, long before she understood that most people considered it a disadvantage. She read Voss clearly, the condescending slowness he used when speaking to her, as if talking louder and more deliberately, somehow made the words travel differently. She took the chart back. "Read it." Every box filled. Every notation timed and initialed. She slid it back across the nurse's station counter without a word. Voss glanced up then, irritated that she hadn't reacted the way he expected. "I'm saying it needs more clinical detail on the wound assessment. The section about drainage output." Maya pulled the chart again, flipped to page 3, pointed to the drainage documentation, 7 notations across a 12-hour shift, volume recorded to the milliliter, color description in standardized terminology, odor indicators checked. Voss stared at it for 3 full seconds. "Fine," he said, and walked away. That was the thing about being dismissed all the time. It made you meticulous. It made you document everything twice, anticipate every challenge before it arrived, leave no gaps that someone could slide a criticism through. Maya Arden had spent 4 years at Haverstone Regional Medical Center, doing exactly that, being 3 steps ahead of every doctor who'd already decided she couldn't keep up. Clocked out, changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, and stood at the back entrance of the hospital for a moment, feeling the night air hit her face. Caldwell City spread out to the east in a low amber glow. Behind the hospital, running west for about 30 miles before it broke into the foothills, was the Aldermore Forest, a dense, municipal wilderness preserve threaded through with hiking trails that the city had been managing since the 1970s. Maya had discovered the trails 2 years ago when she'd first moved to Caldwell. She ran them at night, sometimes when she couldn't sleep, which was often. Tonight she wasn't planning to go far. Just the first 3 miles of the Ridgeback Trail, which she knew well enough to walk in the dark. She had her headlamp, her worn-out trail runners, a water bottle, and the kind of exhaustion that didn't feel like tiredness, it felt like pressure behind her eyes and tension in her shoulders that wouldn't release until she'd moved through something physical. She didn't think about Voss as she walked into the trees. She rarely thought about the hospital once she'd left it. That had been a skill she'd learned in a different life, the ability to compartmentalize, to leave one context behind and step fully into the next. In the military, that skill kept you functional. In civilian life, it just kept you sane. The Ridgeback Trail climbed gradually for the first mile, then leveled out along a ridge that gave a partial view of the city lights through the canopy. Maya moved steadily, her headlamp cutting a white circle ahead of her, the world around her entirely silent in the way her world always was. She watched the trail, watched the movement of trees and peripheral vision, watched shadows the way people who relied on hearing never learned to. She had gone maybe a mile and a half when she stopped. Something was wrong with the shadows near the old fire access road. The Aldermore Forest had a handful of unpaved service roads that the city's forestry department used for maintenance. They were gated, technically off-limits to the public, though the gates were old, and the locks were the kind that rusted open with patience. Maya had crossed the fire access road on this trail before it intersected about 2 miles in, just past the dry creek bed. But she wasn't at the intersection yet. She was looking at lights that weren't where lights should be, not flashlights. Something steadier, the kind of light that came from a vehicle with its running lights on, parked and idling. She could feel the vibration in the ground, actually, a faint rhythmic tremor that her feet registered before her brain caught up with it. Diesel engine, heavy vehicle. Maya turned off her headlamp and stood still. The darkness collapsed around her immediately, and she waited, letting her eyes adjust. The human eye needed about 8 minutes to reach full scotopic vision. She knew this the way she knew a lot of things that most people had no reason to remember. She counted to 90, which was enough. When the shapes resolved, she counted 3 vehicles. Two large panel vans and what looked like a utility truck, all parked along the fire access road about 200 meters north of the trail intersection. Men were moving between the vehicles. She counted 6, then 8, then more. They were carrying things. Large cases, the kind with hard shells and foam interiors that Maya recognized from a context she hadn't lived in for years. She recognized the cases because she had packed identical ones in 2 different combat zones. Weapons cases, not hunting rifles, not recreational firearms. The cases were the wrong shape and too many, and the men carrying them moved with a precise efficiency that didn't look like anything recreational at all. Maya crouched behind a fallen Douglas fir that had come down in last winter's ice storm. She was far enough back in the darkness that her position was invisible. She watched. There were 12 men that she could count, possibly more inside the vehicles. They were working systematically, unloading, checking, repacking. 2 of them had a large paper map spread across the hood of the utility truck, and one was pointing at it with a flashlight, while the other marked sections with a pen. The one with the pen was giving instructions. She could tell by the way the others periodically broke from their tasks and gathered to look at the map before dispersing again. They were planning something. Not casually. This was coordinated, rehearsed-looking work. Maya's mind went to the news cycle she'd been half following for the past 2 weeks, the federal investigation that had moved into Caldwell City. Caught fragments of it on the hospital breakroom television, something about a trafficking network that had been operating through multiple states, and a federal task force that had set up a regional command center somewhere in the city. Coverage had been frustratingly vague, but she remembered one detail because it had struck her as strange. The task force's field operations center was reportedly mobile, which meant it moved between locations and wasn't publicly identified. Thought about that now. A mobile federal command center, location unknown, conducting operations in and around Caldwell City, and 12 men in the forest with weapons cases and maps. She needed to move. She needed to move carefully, and now, Maya backed away from the fallen tree, staying low, keeping her movement slow. Speed made noise even in silence. She'd learned that the hard way, once in a dark that was much darker than this one. She moved heel to toe across the trail surface, staying on the packed dirt and away from the dry leaves at the edges. 20 meters. 40. She rounded a bend in the trail and put the ridge between herself and the vehicles before she stood up straight and started moving fast. She ran the 1.5 miles back to the hospital parking lot in 11 minutes, which was not good time by her standards, but was good time for a woman running blind on a dark trail with a headlamp she didn't dare turn on. She came out of the tree line breathing hard, both palms scraped from where she'd caught herself on a root, her left ankle sending a dull protest signal from a bad step on the slope. She didn't stop. She kept moving, crossed the parking lot, and pushed through the back entrance of Haverstone Regional. The emergency department was mid-shift busy. 2 trauma bays occupied, a cluster of nurses at the station, the controlled urgent movement of a department that was functional but stressed. The charge nurse, a broad-shouldered man named Russell Petit, who had been working Haverstone's ED for 11 years, looked up when Maya came in. Took in her appearance no scrubs, trail clothes, scraped hands, breathing hard, and his expression shifted from surprise to concern. "What happened to you?" She moved to the nurse's station and grabbed a notepad. Wrote quickly, "I need to call 911. I saw armed men in the forest. Fire access road north of Ridgeback Trail intersection. Weapons cases, at least 12 people. Please, I need a phone." Russell read it. The concern on his face shifted to something more complicated. "Maya, armed men. Military-grade equipment. North Fire Access Road. Please. Okay, slow down." He was speaking carefully, and she read every word. "You were out on the trail at midnight. You saw something in the dark. I know what I saw. I'm not saying you don't. I'm saying it's dark out there. Could have been..." She was already moving around the station toward the wall phone. Russell stepped around and got there first, not blocking her exactly, but standing in the way, with the posture of someone who thought he was being protective. "Call," he said. "I'll call. Just sit down for a second, okay? You're bleeding." She looked at her palms. She hadn't noticed the blood smeared across the left one. "Fine." She stepped back, watched him dial. He spoke to the dispatcher for about 90 seconds. She read what she could from his profile. He was describing her. She could tell. Describing the situation from the outside. "Nurse, just came off shift. Says she saw something in the woods." The word "says" appeared at least twice. The dispatcher's response made him nod several times with the nod of someone being reassured. He hung up. "They're sending a patrol unit to check the area," he said. "It's the best I can do. Come on, let's get your hands cleaned up." Maya didn't move. "Did you tell them what I said, armed men?" Weapons cases, not just somebody in the woods. I told them what you told me. Did you tell them weapons cases? Military equipment? Paused half a second too long. I gave them the information. They're going to send someone to look. She picked up the notepad again. I need to talk to someone with more authority than a patrol unit. Russell's expression shifted into something she'd seen 100 times, the careful, patient face of someone who had already decided what was true and was now managing the situation around that decision. Maya, it's midnight. You've been on shift since 7 a.m. You went for a run in the dark in the forest. You're exhausted. And put the notepad down and walked out. Caldwell City Police Department's Central Precinct was a 15-minute drive from Haverstone Regional. Maya took a rideshare because her own car was in the shop, and she sat in the back seat watching the driver's GPS and willing the traffic lights to be green. Precinct's front desk officer was a young man with a name tag that said Dollins, and he listened to Maya's written account with the focused attention of someone who was waiting for his turn to respond. When she slid the notepad across the desk, he read it, and she watched his face, and she saw the moment his expression settled into its conclusion before he'd finished reading. Do you want to have a seat? He said. I want to speak to a supervisor. It's after midnight, ma'am. I can take your statement, and I need a supervisor now. Please, she underlined the last word twice. He made her wait 11 minutes. She sat in a plastic chair and watched the door behind the desk and felt the clock moving and thought about 12 men in weapons cases and a map on the hood of a truck. The supervisor was a woman in her 40s named Lieutenant Carrie Phelps, with the tired competence of someone who had been doing this job long enough to have seen everything at least twice. She sat across from Maya at a table in a side room and read Maya's written account carefully, which was more than most people had done tonight. You're a nurse at Haverstone Regional, Phelps said. Yes, I'm also a former military trauma medic. I know what weapons cases look like. I know what pre-operation movement looks like. What I saw in that forest was a coordinated team preparing for something. Phelps looked at the notepad, former military. Which branch? Army, 4 years. 2 overseas deployments. Something in the lieutenant's posture shifted, not much, but enough. Where were you deployed? Maya wrote 2 locations. Phelps looked at them for a moment. Okay, she said. Tell me what you saw, specifically, everything. So Maya told her. She wrote steadily, adding details she'd been holding back, because she hadn't yet been given the chance to say them. The configuration of the vehicles, the distance between them, the posture and movement of the men, the size and shape of the cases, the way the map was oriented on the truck hood based on which direction the pointer's flashlight had been angled. She wrote about the vibration she'd felt from the diesel engine and her estimate of vehicle weight. She wrote her approximate GPS position based on her knowledge of the trail. Phelps read everything twice. Give me a few minutes, she said, and left the room. She was gone for 22 minutes. When she came back, her expression had changed in a way Maya couldn't entirely read, something between urgency and controlled unease. Federal task force operating in this city, Phelps said. I've made a call. Someone's going to come talk to you. How long? Not long. It was 40 minutes. Maya sat in that room with a cup of coffee that went cold, and her scraped hands folded on the table, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned how to wait without unraveling. The man who came through the door was not in uniform. He was tall, mid-50s, wearing a jacket over a collared shirt, with the rumpled look of someone who had been asleep or almost asleep when the phone rang. Sat down across from Maya without introducing himself first, which she found interesting. Then he held up a badge, FBI Special Agent Cord Makeley. Lieutenant Phelps says you have information about activity in the Aldermore Forest, he said. Spoke at a normal pace, facing her directly, and she appreciated that he hadn't adjusted his register. He was talking to her the way he would talk to anyone. Yes, she slid her notepad across. I've written everything down. He read it without rushing. When he finished, he went back and reread 2 sections. Then he looked up the vehicles. Can you describe them again? More specifically. Could. Describe them precisely. Panel van dimensions, the utility truck's visible rear compartment, the approximate wheelbase, the color in low light. She described the case dimensions and how many she'd counted being carried. She described the map-reading posture and the direction of the pointing arm. Makeley asked 3 more questions, each precise, each the kind of question that only made sense if you understood tactical planning. She answered all 3. He watched her face while she wrote, and she watched his, and she understood that he was evaluating her, and she understood that this was appropriate. Who else have you talked to tonight? He asked. The hospital charge nurse. The desk officer here. What did you tell them? Enough. Not everything. I could tell they didn't need everything. He looked at her for a moment. What made you know to hold back the specific details? She thought about how to answer. She wrote, because specific details get lost when the listener has already decided what they're hearing. I gave general information to people who were going to pass it up the chain. I saved the specifics for whoever was actually going to act on them. Makeley read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to make some calls. I need you to stay here. She stayed. What happened in the next 4 hours would be described differently by different people, depending on who they were and what they'd been doing. At 12:47 a.m., when the Aldermore alert went out through federal channels, the FBI agents who responded described it as a rapid assembly operation, coordinated across 3 field offices. Caldwell City Police Department later characterized it as a joint jurisdiction response. The local news would call it unprecedented. Maya sat in the side room at the precinct and watched through the window as the parking lot outside filled with vehicles. Makeley came back at 2:15 a.m. We're moving on the location, he said. I need you to come with us. You're going to guide a team to the specific position where you observed the vehicles. Can you do that? Yes. Do you understand what you're consenting to? This is an active federal operation. You're a civilian consultant. You follow instructions from the lead agent at all times. Completely clear. Good. He stood. Let's go. They gave her a vest. Not body armor, they weren't putting a civilian in body armor, but a high-visibility vest with consultant stenciled across the back, which she put on over her trail jacket. A young female agent named Torres stayed within arm's reach of her throughout, which Maya understood was equal parts protection and management. She didn't mind. She would have done the same. The convoy moved out at 2:22 a.m. Maya sat in the back seat of a black SUV and watched the city streets give way to the dark fringe of the Aldermore, and felt something settle in her that she hadn't felt in a long time, not calm exactly, but focus. Specific, clean focus that came from moving toward something instead of away from it. The vehicles stopped at the Ridgeback Trail access point. Agents moved efficiently in the dark, which Maya recognized. She recognized a lot of things about this that she hadn't felt since she'd left the army, the cadence of people who did this professionally, the shorthand signals, the way a team contracted and expanded depending on terrain. She led Torres and Makeley and a 4-person point team through the first 1.5 miles of the trail, headlamp off, moving at the pace she'd set on her way out. Stopped at the position where she'd first seen the lights and crouched. The vehicles were gone. She felt Makeley looking at her. She didn't flinch. She was already scanning the ground. She moved 10 meters off the trail, staying low, looking for tire tracks on the fire access road surface. The dry packed dirt held impressions poorly, but she found a line of crushed vegetation along the road edge, consistent with a large vehicle driving on the shoulder. She pointed at it, then pointed north, indicating the direction the vehicles had most likely moved. She found the position where she had crouched behind the fallen Douglas fir. The ground in front of it had compression marks her own knees, her own boot toes. She pointed at them, then pointed toward where the vehicles had been. Makeley crouched beside her and looked. He spoke quietly into his radio. Within the next 20 minutes, the FBI's evidence recovery team found the map site. Not the map they'd taken that, but the marks on the ground where multiple sets of boots had stood around the hood of a truck, the faint oil stain where the engine had been idling, 2 crushed cigarette filters near the shoulder of the access road. And then, 30 meters north of that position, tucked into the base of a rocky outcropping off the fire access road, they found a cache. Maya wasn't permitted near it. Torres gently moved her back as the evidence team went forward. But she saw enough the hardshell cases, dark green, stacked 3 high and 4 wide against the rock face, partially covered with a camouflage net. She felt Makeley's hand on her arm. He turned her to face him. You were right, he said. About all of it. She nodded. Kept his eyes on her face. Tell me something. In your military training, you said you were a trauma medic. The way you described the team's movement patterns, the operational setup that's not standard medic training. She looked at him steadily. He waited. She took the notepad from her jacket pocket and wrote 1 line. I'll answer that question. But not tonight. Makeley read it. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, then nodded once, the nod of a man who understood that some answers arrived on their own schedule. He turned back toward the cache site. Agents moved around him with equipment and lights, and the Aldermore forest was suddenly, utterly alive with Federal Presence radios, flashlights, the crackle of coordinated movement through the trees. Maya stood at the edge of it and watched. It should have felt like relief. And it did, partly. But underneath the relief was something else. Something she hadn't anticipated, the slow, cold recognition that the cache had been moved into position before she'd stumbled on those men tonight. This hadn't been preparation for something distant. Timeline she was running in her head, based on the volume of equipment and the efficiency of the team she'd observed, said that whatever they were planning had been close. Very close. And something else. She ran it through her mind again. 12 men. That volume of equipment. The location relative to the federal task force's known area of operation. She had been thinking of this as an attack on law enforcement. Standing here now, watching the FBI move through the trees, she was revising that conclusion. The cache wasn't positioned for a static defense or a single-direction strike. The equipment distribution was wrong for that. The map-reading dynamic two-people planning, others receiving suggested not a single target but a routing operation. Multiple moves, multiple destinations. She pulled out the notepad, tapped Makeley on the shoulder. He turned, she wrote. This wasn't only about attacking the task force. Positioning and team structure suggests a routing operation. Multiple targets. I think there's something else, a secondary location. Maybe inside the city. Makeley read it twice. His face did something she hadn't seen it do yet. He grabbed his radio. 3 miles to the east, at Haverstone Regional Medical Center, the overnight security system logged an unauthorized access event at 3:41 a.m. A restricted personnel door opened with a keycard that had been flagged for deactivation 6 weeks ago, which no one had noticed because the deactivation order had been submitted to the wrong department and had sat into queue ever since. The door led to the hospital's administrative records floor. Keycard belonged to someone who was at that moment supposed to be unreachable. But Maya Arden didn't know that yet. She was standing in a forest, watching agents process a weapons cache, her mind turning over a pattern that didn't fully make sense and wouldn't, until 2 days later, when the name she read in an FBI briefing document made every piece of the last 4 years collapse into a single, terrible clarity. 2 days passed before Maya saw the briefing document. In the hours immediately after the cache discovery, Makeley had her driven back to the precinct while the forest off-race operation expanded around the location she'd identified. She sat in the same side room, drank more bad coffee, and waited while the night moved toward morning outside the window. Torres checked on her twice, once to ask if she needed anything, and once to tell her that the operation was still active and that someone would be with her shortly. Shortly turned into 90 minutes. Maya used the time to write everything she could remember about the men she'd observed, movement patterns, physical descriptions, the way they'd organized themselves around the task. She filled 6 pages of the notepad. At 5:10 a.m. Makeley came back. He looked like a man who had been running on adrenaline for 3 hours and was beginning to feel the edges of it wearing off. We're processing the scene, he said. It's going to take most of the day. I need you to come in tomorrow afternoon formally. The witness. What did you find? More than we expected. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push, because she understood that was the answer she was going to get. What about the secondary location? He looked at her for a moment. We're looking at that. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. He pulled out a card and set it on the table. Some sleep. Be at the federal building at 2 p.m. tomorrow. Anything comes back to you, anything at all, call that number. She took the card. She looked at it, then looked at him. You already found something in the city, didn't you? It wasn't a question. She'd learned to read faces across distances and across languages and across the particular blankness that trained professionals wore when they were managing information. Makeley's face did a small, controlled thing, a fractional tension in the jaw that told her she was right. He didn't confirm it. He thanked her and walked out, and Maya sat for a moment with the card in her hand before she called another rideshare and went home. She slept for 5 hours. It wasn't good sleep. It was the thin, surface kind where her mind kept running the same images, the shadows between the trees, the case dimensions, the map on the hood of the truck, and she'd surface from it briefly, check the time, go under again. When she woke up for the last time at 11 a.m., she lay still for a moment and let the previous night settle into a shape she could hold. Then she got up and went to work, because her shift started at noon. Haverstone Regional Medical Center operated on a rhythm that the staff called the machine, a slightly contemptuous term that acknowledged both the hospital's competence and its absolute service to the people running it. Shifts turned over, patients moved through, departments communicated in the clipped shorthand of people who needed to transfer information faster than complete sentences allowed. Maya had learned to navigate it efficiently. She was good at efficiency. She was good at a lot of things that didn't require hearing. She was in the middle of a wound assessment on a patient in Bay 4 when she felt someone standing behind her. She finished the assessment before she turned around. Dr. Harlan Voss was there, and behind him, slightly to the left, was Dr. Garrett Stoll, the department's clinical director, who was above Voss in the hierarchy, and who spoke to Maya approximately once every 6 weeks, usually to inform her of a scheduling change. Stoll was in his late 50s, heavy-jowled, with the look of a man who had once been forceful and had let that quality curdle into something blunter. "When you're done," Voss said, in the careful loud register she'd asked him 3 times not to use, capped her pen, completed the notation on the patient's chart, and turned to face both of them. "Conference room," Stoll said. "Now, please." The conference room was a small glass-walled space off the main corridor. Stoll closed the door. Voss stood to the side with his arms crossed, in the posture of someone who had already decided he'd won whatever was about to happen. Stoll placed a single sheet of paper on the table and pushed it toward Maya. She looked at it. It was a performance review of a formal one, on hospital letterhead dated that morning. She scanned it quickly. Phrases surfaced. Communication barriers affecting patient care efficiency, clinical judgment concerns raised by senior staff, inability to integrate with team communication protocols. She looked up. Stoll was watching her with the expression of a man delivering news he considered unfortunate but necessary. "This has been building for some time," he said. "I want to be straightforward with you. Dr. Voss has raised concerns on multiple occasions, and after review, the department agrees that the current arrangement isn't working." Maya pulled the notepad from her pocket. "Define current arrangement." Stoll glanced at the notepad. A small flicker of something crossed his face: impatience, or discomfort at having to wait for a response. "Your placement in the trauma department. We're recommending a transfer to a lower acuity unit, patient wound care, or the preoperative prep floor." "On what clinical basis?" "I just explained listed phrases. I'm asking for specific clinical incidents where my patient outcomes were substandard." Stoll opened his mouth and then closed it. Voss stepped forward. "This isn't about outcomes. It's about the ability to function as part of a team in a high-pressure environment. Communication in a trauma bay needs to be instantaneous. You require," he paused, and she could see him selecting his word carefully, "accommodations that slow the team down." She looked at him for 3 full seconds, then she wrote, "In 4 years in this department, I have not had a single adverse patient event attributable to communication failure. I have covered shifts for 7 different attending physicians without complaint. I have filed 3 formal incident reports that led to protocol improvements. What I require is for my record to be evaluated on its actual content." She slid the notepad to Stoll. He read it. He did not look comfortable, but he also did not look moved. "The decision's been made," he said. "The transfer is effective at the end of this pay period. HR will be in touch about the paperwork." He picked up the performance review and left the room. Voss lingered for a moment. He looked at her with something she couldn't quite categorize, not cruelty exactly, more like relief. The relief of someone who had wanted something for a long time and had finally gotten it. "It's nothing personal," he said. She didn't write anything. She just looked at him until he left. She sat in the empty conference room for 4 minutes. She was not going to cry. She hadn't cried in a professional context since her second deployment, and she wasn't about to start now, but she held herself very still and waited for the first wave of it to pass. The anger was cleaner than the hurt. She focused on the anger. Then she picked up her notepad and went back to work, because there were still 4 hours left in her shift, and 3 patients waiting on assessments, and whatever Stoll and Voss had decided didn't change that. She was at the federal building at 1:58 p.m. the following day. The formal witness interview lasted 3.5 hours. 2 agents she hadn't met conducted most of it, a man named Pritchard and a woman named Selk, both methodical in the way that suggested significant practice. They asked her to describe the events of 2 nights ago in a specific sequence, then varied the sequence and asked again, then asked about specific details from different angles. It was a standard technique for validating eyewitness accounts. She knew this, and she cooperated with it fully, because she understood its purpose. Makeley appeared for the last 40 minutes. He sat in the corner and observed without speaking until near the end, when Pritchard and Selk both gathered their materials and excused themselves, and the room suddenly felt quieter. Cache contained enough material to arm a 12-person tactical team for an extended operation, Makeley said. Weapons, communications equipment, medical supplies. The medical supplies were interesting. Maya looked at him. "Military-grade trauma kits," he said. "The organized kind. Kind that suggests someone on the team had real medical training, not just basic first aid." She wrote, "What did you find in the city?" He looked at the notepad for a moment. "Then we had an unauthorized access event at Haverstone Regional, the night you found the cache. Administrative records floor. Whoever accessed the records pulled files relating to patient admissions over the past 3 months. Something moved through her that wasn't quite surprise. Patient admissions connected to what? To the federal investigation. Several of the individuals under our surveillance had received medical treatment at Haverstone in the past 90 days, under false names in most cases, but the admission records would still allow a careful reader to cross-reference movement timelines. She sat with that for a moment. Someone inside the hospital pulled those records. The working theory. And the keycard that accessed the floor? Makeley's expression was careful. Belonged to a staff member. Someone currently on administrative leave, she wrote. Who? He shook his head. That's as far as I can go right now. The investigation's ongoing. She looked at him steadily. He met her eyes and didn't look away, which she respected. He wasn't uncomfortable giving her partial information. He was just clear about the limits of it. She wrote one more thing. When this is over, I want to know everything. He read it. If I can do that, he said, I will. She spent the next 3 days on her regular schedule, now technically reassigned to the outpatient wound care unit, pending the formal transfer date. Wound care was quieter than the trauma department. Patients were less acute, the pace was slower, and the nurses she worked with were kind to her in a way that felt slightly like condolence. They'd heard about the transfer, or they'd inferred it, and they were being careful around her in the way people were careful around someone who had lost something. She didn't need their carefulness. She needed to think. At night she went over everything she knew about the men in the forest, about the cache, about what Makeley had told her, and she ran it against what she knew about Haverstone Regional, its layout, its personnel, its administrative structure, specific access points and data flows she'd learned in 4 years of working there. She wasn't investigating. She didn't have the standing or the authority to investigate, but she was watching, in the way she'd always watched carefully, from the periphery, gathering information that other people generated without meaning to. On the 4th day, something shifted. She was finishing a wound dressing on a patient in the outpatient suite when she noticed Dr. Voss in the corridor outside, talking on his phone. This was not unusual. People talked on their phones in hospital corridors constantly. But Voss was on the far end of the corridor, near the exit that connected to the administrative wing, and his posture was wrong. Not the upright, mildly imperious posture he carried in clinical settings. Turned toward the wall, shoulders rounded, one hand pressed to his free ear, which was the posture of someone managing a conversation they didn't want overheard. She finished the dressing. She walked the corridor to the supply closet at the far end, which took her past Voss at a distance of about 6 feet, kept her eyes forward and her pace even. But she was watching him in her peripheral vision, and she caught the reflection of his face in the glass panel of the exit door, his mouth, specifically, because reading a reflection was harder than reading direct speech, but not impossible when you'd been doing it your whole life. She caught 2 words before she was past him and through the supply closet door. Already moved. She stood in the supply closet, with her hand on a shelf of gauze rolls, and breathed for a moment. Already moved could mean anything. It could mean a patient. Could mean furniture. It could mean money in a personal account. Could mean 100 things she wasn't equipped to interpret without context. Sat in her chest wrong. She went home that evening and stood in her kitchen and looked out the window at the amber glow of Caldwell City and thought about the pattern, the keycard access, the administrative records, the weapons cache, the medical supplies. And now those 2 words, and she took out Makeley's card and held it, put it down. She picked it up again. She called. It went to voicemail. She texted instead because she'd learned early that phone calls were often impractical for her, and that a detailed text message reached the right person faster than a voicemail that required a callback. She wrote, I may have observed something at the hospital. I'm not certain it's relevant. I'd like to discuss it in person. Tomorrow. His response came 11 minutes later. I'll come to you. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Send me an address. She sent her address. Then she put the phone down and made herself eat something and tried to sleep, which didn't come easily, because her mind kept returning to the corridor and the reflection and those 2 words and the list of people who had access to the administrative records floor and the specific, uncomfortable question she hadn't let herself fully form yet. Makeley arrived at 7:53 a.m. He was alone, which surprised her slightly. She'd expected Torres or another agent. He had coffee in 2 cups, which she appreciated. She told him what she'd seen. She wrote it out precisely, including her uncertainty about whether the reflection lip read was accurate and her acknowledgement that the phrase could have an innocent explanation. He read it without his expression doing much. Then he looked up. Has Voss ever shown any knowledge of the federal investigation? Not that I've seen, but I've never had reason to watch him specifically. Would you recognize him as someone who acts differently than you'd expect in professional contexts? Thought about this honestly. He's arrogant. He's dismissive. He's politically motivated in how he manages his department. But none of those things are unusual for a doctor in his position. The phone call posture was different from his normal behavior. That's all I can say with confidence. Makeley nodded slowly. I'm going to share something with you, he said. This doesn't leave this conversation, and it's not for you to act on. Understood? Understood. The key card that accessed the administrative floor. Staff member it belonged to. They were placed on administrative leave 2 months ago. A licensing complaint unrelated to our investigation. He paused. Card was deactivated through a request submitted under a different staff member's authorization. And that authorization was signed by a supervising physician. Maya kept her face still. Which supervising physician? He held her gaze. I can't tell you that yet, but she was already revising the pattern in her mind. The deactivation request submitted under a wrong name. The access that should have been blocked and wasn't. The administrative records that shouldn't have been reachable and were. The phone call in the corridor, she wrote, Is the physician still working at Haverstone? Makeley looked at her for a moment that was 1 second too long. As of yesterday, he said yes. The request came from HR on a Thursday. Maya's formal transfer to the outpatient wound care unit was being processed effective the following Monday. She was asked to complete 2 acknowledgement forms and return her trauma department keycard. Completed the forms. She returned the keycard. She was in the elevator going up to the main nursing floor when she ran into Stull. He didn't see her at first. He was looking at his phone, and he got in the elevator. And then he registered her presence and did the small recalibration that people made when they encountered someone they'd recently done something difficult to. Maya, he said. She nodded. The transfer going smoothly? She nodded again, because she didn't have the notepad out and wasn't going to get into a conversation about it in an elevator. He looked back at his phone. The elevator moved. Then, just before it reached his floor, he said, For what it's worth, the decision wasn't unanimous. The doors opened and he walked out. Maya rode up 1 more floor thinking about that. The decision wasn't unanimous, which meant someone on the reviewing committee had pushed back, which meant there was at least 1 person in Haverstone's administration who had looked at her record and seen something different than what Voss was presenting. She filed that information away without knowing yet what to do with it, crossing the main corridor toward the nursing station when she saw the man. He was in the waiting area outside the trauma department, a large waiting room that opened onto the main corridor with a row of chairs and a television mounted in the corner. He was sitting in one of the chairs, dressed in civilian clothes, reading a folded newspaper. Late 40s. Olive complexion, close-cropped dark hair with gray at the temples. He had a small bandage visible on his left forearm, which was consistent with being a patient or accompanying a patient. She would have walked past him without a second look. But his eyes moved across the corridor in a sweep that had nothing to do with idle waiting room attention, and the sweep tracked moving staff members with a specificity that didn't belong to someone with nothing to do. She kept walking. She went around the corner and stopped, pressing her back against the corridor wall, and thought, I'd seen that kind of watching before. Systematic. Cataloging. The kind of situational awareness that was trained into people and never fully turned off. She'd done it herself that morning at the coffee shop without noticing. She pulled out her phone and texted Makeley. There is a man in the trauma department waiting room at Haverstone right now who doesn't match the behavioral profile of a patient or a visitor. Mid-40s, olive complexion, gray temple dark hair, left forearm bandage. He's watching staff movement patterns. She didn't expect an immediate response. She got 1 in 4 minutes. Don't approach. Don't alter your behavior. We're aware of the waiting room. Is he still there? She went back to the corner and took a half step to look. He was gone. She texted no longer in waiting room. Makeley, which direction? She looked both ways down the corridor. 15 people visible, moving in the ordinary flows of a busy hospital. She couldn't identify him among them, lost him. A pause. Then go about your shift. Do not discuss this with anyone at the hospital. Call me when you finish. She put the phone away. She went to the nursing station and picked up the first chart in her queue and read it with complete attention, because that was what the situation required, and because the ability to give something complete attention while something else entirely was happening in the back of your mind was a skill she'd learned under circumstances that made this feel manageable by comparison. 6:14 p.m., 46 minutes before her shift ended. Her phone vibrated. It was not Makeley's number. It was an internal hospital extension, the administrative offices on the 5th floor. She didn't recognize the extension. She answered the way she always answered unknown calls, by texting the number back with her name and asking them to communicate by text. The response came from a direct number, not the extension, Miss Arden. My name is Devin Norcross. I'm an attorney. I've been retained by a party who has information that affects both the federal investigation and your employment situation at Haverstone Regional. I need to meet with you tonight. This is time sensitive. She read it twice, then she texted Makeley the entire exchange. His response took 90 seconds. Don't respond to that number. Don't go anywhere alone tonight. I'll explain when I see you. Where are you right now? She told him. His response, stay in the building. I'm sending someone. She stood at the nurse's station with the phone in her hand and the shift noise moving around her and felt the particular quality of a situation that was tightening the sense of pieces she hadn't known were moving, all arriving at the same point at the same time. Torres appeared at the end of the corridor at 6:31 p.m., in plainclothes, walking with the unhurried purpose of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Spotted Maya, came straight to her, and said quietly, Agent Makeley needs you now. Can you leave the floor? What happened? Torres glanced around the corridor. She was doing the thing that all of them did, checking who was close, who might hear. The man from the waiting room, she said. We identified him. Maya waited. Torres looked at her steadily. He works here. He's been on staff at Haverstone Regional Medical Center for 6 years. She paused. He's not a physician. He's in hospital administration. And he has unrestricted keycard access to every floor in the building. The floor didn't drop out from under Maya. She had been in situations before where the ground changed without warning, and she'd learned a long time ago that the only useful response was to adjust her footing and keep moving. But something cold moved through her as she understood what Torres was telling her, that the man she'd flagged, the man with the trained eyes and the cataloging attention and the bandaged left arm, was not an outsider who had walked into the hospital. He had been inside to Haverstone the entire time. Whatever he had been doing here for 6 years, it was not administration. Torres walked her out through the staff exit on the building's north side, not the main entrance, which told Maya that someone had made a decision about which corridors she should and shouldn't be visible in. She didn't ask. She matched Torres's pace and kept her eyes moving the way she'd been trained to move them, not searching, just open, registering everything without fixing on anything. The black SUV was parked in the ambulance bay overflow lot. Makeley was in the front passenger seat. He got out when he saw them, and his face had the look of a man who had been managing multiple problems simultaneously and had just had one of them get significantly larger. Spoke as she reached him, facing her directly. The man you flagged, his name is Warren Telt. He's been employed at Haverstone Regional as an administrative coordinator since 6 years ago. Clean personnel file, no disciplinary history, solid performance reviews. He paused. He's also a former military contractor who dropped off government employment records 8 years ago in a way that doesn't happen by accident. Maya wrote, what does that mean? It means someone helped him disappear from one identity and build another one. That takes resources and organization. He looked at her steadily. It also means he's been inside your hospital for 6 years as a placement, not as an accident. She absorbed that. He was there to watch the investigation from inside. That's our working theory. The federal task force in Caldwell has been active for 14 months. Telt's role would have been to monitor staff, monitor patient flows, monitor any law enforcement contact that came through the ER. Hospitals are useful that way, they see everyone eventually. And he was the one who pulled the administrative records. Think so. The key card on the deactivated account, we've traced the authorization chain further. The physician who signed the deactivation request did so 3 weeks ago. Before that, for a brief window, keycard was valid but flagged, which means Telt could use it and it would register as an error in the system without triggering an automatic lockout. Someone who understood the hospital's access protocol would know that gap existed. Maya held the notepad against her leg for a moment and looked at the amber-lit hospital exterior. 6 years. She had worked in that building for 4 of those 6 years, passing through corridors and staff rooms and cafeteria lines, and Telt had been there the entire time watching, waiting, forwarding information to people who were planning whatever had been stored in those cases in the forest. She wrote, where is he now? We don't know. You lost him. Makeley's jaw tightened slightly. He's not in the building. He didn't use his keycard to exit through any monitored door in the last 90 minutes, which means he went out through an unmonitored access point. Haverstone has 3 of those maintenance corridor exits that aren't on the badge reader system. I know which ones, she wrote quickly. Loading dock on the east side. The boiler room stairwell that exits behind the generator pad. And the old imaging wing connector that was supposed to be sealed after the renovation, but the latch is broken. It opens into the parking structure on level 2. Makeley turned to Torres immediately. Torres already had her radio out. Maya wrote, the parking structure on level 2 connects to the Delmar Street exit. From there, you're 3 blocks from the Aldermore access road. He read it and said something short into Torres's radio that Maya couldn't see from the angle. Then he turned back. How do you know the latch on the imaging wing connector is broken? Because I reported it to facilities management 14 months ago, and it still hasn't been fixed. She looked at him. I notice things that don't get fixed. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite something else, something in between that she didn't have a clean label for. Get in the car, he said. We're not leaving you here. They took her to the federal field office, which was not the main federal building downtown, but a secondary location in a converted office park on the west side of the city, nondescript, unmarkable, kind of building you drove past 100 times without registering. Inside it was controlled chaos, agents at workstations, wall screens with maps and timelines, the low urgent hum of people working a situation that was moving faster than the plan. Makeley sat her in a conference room with a laptop and asked her to review a series of personnel photographs hospital staff. Some she recognized and some she didn't. He told her to flag anyone she'd seen behaving unusually in the last 2 weeks, with the explicit understanding that her flags were informational, not accusatory. She worked through 63 photographs over the next hour and 40 minutes. She flagged 4 people. Telt was not in the photographs, which she understood meant they already had him identified and were managing that separately. Of the 4 she flagged, one was a billing administrator she'd seen twice in clinical areas where billing administrators had no reason to be. One was a physician's assistant who had twice asked her questions about patient admission procedures that were outside his normal scope. One was a facilities worker she'd seen accessing the administrative records corridor 3 different times without a cart or equipment, which was unusual for facilities. And one was a woman she'd seen in the hospital cafeteria 4 times in 10 days, always at a corner table, always with a clear sightline to the main staff entrance, and always alone, who wore a visitor badge but whose clothing and posture were wrong for a visitor. Makeley reviewed her flags. He left the room with the list. Came back 12 minutes later, and his face had shifted into something sharper. Facilities worker, he said. We have a flag on him, from a different source. Independent confirmation. He put the photograph back on the table. The woman in the cafeteria, we've been watching her for 3 days. We didn't know she was going into the hospital. Maya wrote, she goes in through the outpatient entrance on the south side. Visitor badges at that entrance are self-printed from a kiosk. Photo ID is not verified against a database. The kiosk just reads the ID and prints the badge. How do you know that? Because when I had to bring a friend to an outpatient appointment 2 years ago and forgot my own ID, I watched the process. I've never forgotten a security gap. He looked at her across the table. Maya, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. She waited. Your military record. When I asked you about it in the forest, you said you'd answer, but not that night. I need to ask now. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up the pen. I was a trauma medic for 4 years. That part's accurate. But my last 18 months of service were attached to a joint special operations unit on a task-specific basis. Not as a combatant, as a medical specialist for high-risk extraction operations. I observed tactical planning and execution at a level that most medics don't see. When I separated from the Army, I was asked to keep the specifics of that assignment non-public. I've honored that. Makeley read it carefully. Read it again. Why did you leave? She looked at the question for a moment. Then I watched 3 people die in a situation that didn't have to happen. I decided I was better used somewhere I could control the outcomes more directly. I was wrong about that part, as it turns out. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to need your full service record for this investigation. You understand that? I'll authorize the release tomorrow. Thank you. He folded his hands on the table. There's something else I need to tell you. Regarding Haverstone Regional, she waited. The physician who signed the keycard deactivation requests the authorization chain we traced. He paused. Goes through the clinical director's office. Maya set the pen down. Dull. Makeley's face didn't confirm or deny, which was its own kind of confirmation. She sat for a moment with that. Garrett Stull, who had sat across from her in a conference room and told her the decision to remove her from the trauma department had been made, who had handed her a performance review filled with bureaucratic language designed to move a person out of the way quietly. who had said, with the flat tone of an administrator delivering an administrative outcome, that the current arrangement wasn't working. Picked the pen back up. Was the transfer real? Or was it part of moving me away from the area of the building where the record's access happened? Makeley looked at her steadily. We're looking at that. The transfer was engineered to isolate me from the investigation. Then Stull knew I was talking to federal authorities. Which means someone told him. Yes, who? We're working on that. She wrote one more thing and pushed the notepad across. Or he saw me with you. The night of the forest. Hospital security cameras cover the back parking lot. Someone inside reviewed that footage and saw me leave with federal agents. Makeley was already standing. He had his radio in his hand. The next 6 hours moved in a way that felt nothing like the procedural rhythm of the interview process, and everything like the tempo she remembered from operations she wasn't supposed to talk about. Makeley had people moving. The field office shifted from the managed urgency of an ongoing investigation into something faster, and more compressed the pace of a situation that had acquired a deadline, even if the deadline wasn't fully visible yet. Maya stayed in the conference room. Torres brought her food she didn't fully eat, and coffee she drank without tasting. She worked through the logic of what she knew, building it into a shape she could hold. Stull was connected to the operation. Telt was embedded in the hospital. The weapons cache in the forest had been positioned for a routing operation, multiple targets, not one. The Federal Task Force's mobile command center had been somewhere in the city for 14 months, moving locations. If someone inside the hospital had been tracking patient admission records and cross-referencing law enforcement contacts, they could potentially identify not just who was working the investigation, but where those people had sought medical treatment, which areas of the city they moved through, what their patterns looked like. A mobile command center that moved on a schedule, its schedule could be predicted if you had enough data points. Medical data was one of the most intimate datasets that existed. People moved through hospitals at vulnerable moments, when they were hurt or sick or accompanying someone they cared about. They didn't guard themselves the same way. She stopped, picked up the pen. She wrote quickly, 3 lines, and went to the conference room door and knocked on the glass panel until she caught the attention of an agent in the corridor, a young man whose name she didn't know. She held up the notepad. He came to the door, read it, and left at a pace that was faster than the way he'd been moving before. Makeley was back in the room in under 4 minutes, which meant he'd been close. He read what she'd written. The routing operation wasn't targeting the task force directly. It was designed to move the task force, to make the command center change location on an emergency basis, which would expose its movement protocol and reveal the new position. The weapons cache was a contingency for if the movement went wrong or if they needed to hit the convoy during relocation. They weren't planning a siege. They were planning a flush and follow. He read it twice. Where did that come from? The case distribution. Cache wasn't sized for a sustained assault on a fixed position. It was sized for a rapid response interception, and if they had hospital records showing the movement patterns of task force personnel, they could predict which routes the convoy would use. He was already at the door. He stopped, turned back. Command center relocated 2 days ago, after the cache was discovered. To where? I can't tell you that. Does the new location use any of the same route corridors as the old one? He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "Give me the notepad." She gave it to him. He wrote a 2-word response and handed it back. She read it, probably yes. She wrote back, "Then they haven't lost the target. They've just paused. If Telt got out of the hospital tonight, he may already be feeding corrected information to whoever is running the operation." Makeley left the room at a pace she hadn't seen from him yet. At 11:40 p.m., Torres came in and sat down across from Maya and put her hands flat on the table in the way that people did when they were about to deliver news they needed her to hold steadily. "We found Telt," Torres said. "He's in custody. He was picked up 40 minutes ago at an apartment in the Del Mar district." She paused. He wasn't alone. Maya waited. There was a second person in the apartment. "Someone we identified from your photograph review." Torres looked at her carefully. "Facilities worker you flagged." Maya nodded slowly. "They had communications equipment encrypted. The tech team is working on it now." Torres looked down at the table for a moment, and then back up. "There's something else." Telt had a document with him. Printed, not digital. It was a list of names. Something moved through Maya's chest that she couldn't quite name. "What kind of list?" "Personnel. Current Haverstone regional staff." Torres met her eyes. "Your name was on it. 3rd from the top. There was a notation next to it." She wrote. Though her hand was steadier than she felt, what did the notation say? Torres's expression did something careful. It said, "Direct contact. with federal team. Ongoing. Assess and redirect. Maya put the pen down. She understood what redirect meant in this context. It didn't mean transfer to wound care. She sat with that for a moment, the clean, cold understanding that the thing she'd stumbled into in the forest had reached back toward her in a very specific way, and that the performance review and the transfer and the very deliberate removal from the trauma department had not been about Voss's professional opinion of her clinical abilities at all. Someone had wanted her out of the area, out of the building's critical zones, out of the position where she could see things. They had underestimated what she could see from anywhere. Torres was watching her with the quiet concern of someone who understood that this was a lot to absorb. Maya picked the pen back up. Who else was on the list? Can't tell you that yet, but I can tell you that we're moving on it tonight. Torres straightened. Makeley's coordinating arrests, multiple locations, including Haverstone. Torres's answer was in her posture before she said it. The slight forward orientation, the controlled urgency under the careful stillness, including Haverstone, she confirmed. What happened in the next 3 hours was something Maya understood only partially in real time and more fully afterward, when the pieces were assembled for her in a debrief that lasted most of a day. She was not in the field. She remained at the federal office, which was the correct decision, and one she accepted without argument, because she knew what she was and wasn't trained for, and what she wasn't trained for was active law enforcement operations with armed suspects in contained spaces. Her value here was the knowledge in her head, not her presence in a building. But she tracked what she could through Torres, who came in at intervals and provided information she was permitted to provide, and did so with the precise economy of someone who understood that Maya could handle the real version of events. 12:19 a.m. Telt's encrypted communications had been partially decoded. They contained routing information, vehicle schedules, GPS waypoints, timed sequences consistent with the flush and follow theory Maya had outlined. Command Center's most recent relocation route was referenced directly. 12:44 a.m. Simultaneous federal warrants were executed at 6 locations in and around Caldwell City. Haverstone Regional was one of them. At 1:08 a.m., Torres came in and sat down and looked at Maya with an expression that had weight in it. They arrested Garrett Stull at his home 20 minutes ago, she said. He was in the process of shredding documents when agents arrived. His home office had a secondary communications device not connected to any of his registered accounts. Maya absorbed that. Voss? Torres shook her head slightly. We don't have evidence connecting Voss to the network. He may have just been what he appeared to be. A man who wanted me gone for his own reasons. It's that way. She found that almost harder to process than the alternative. The idea that Voss had simply been what she'd always thought he was, a physician who had looked at a deaf nurse and made a decision that had nothing to do with anything except his own limited perception, and that his action, particular small cruelty, had happened to serve another agenda entirely by accident. The mundanity of that was worse than conspiracy. What was Stull's role? Still developing the full picture. But based on what's been found so far, he was providing operational intelligence. Not just about the hospital, about the task force itself. He had contact with 2 agents on the task force who were under internal review. Torres paused. Part's bad. I won't pretend it isn't. Maya looked at the table for a moment. Then she wrote, how long has the operation been running? The criminal side of it. At least 3 years. Possibly longer. And how long has the task force been investigating it? 14 months. So for the last 14 months, someone inside the task force was telling the network how close the investigation was getting. Yes. She sat back. She thought about a weapons cache positioned in the forest outside the city. She thought about medical trauma kits, in those cases the organized kind, for people who knew how to use them. She thought about a man with a trained pair of eyes sitting in a hospital waiting room, watching staff move through corridors, building a picture of patterns and access points and vulnerabilities. She thought about her name, third from the top of a printed list. She thought about what redirect had been intended to mean. How close did they get, she wrote, to actually executing the flush and follow? Torres was quiet for a moment. Then, the timeline on the communications we recovered the operation was scheduled. She looked at Maya directly. 48 hours from now. Maya held that. The night I went into the forest. You found the cache 4 days before the operation was set to move. Torres said it plainly, because that was the most useful way to say it. If it had stayed hidden another 4 days, we wouldn't have known to look. Maya looked at the conference room window, the city's ambient light pressed against the glass from outside, that low amber glow she'd looked at from her kitchen window, the night she'd held Makeley's card, and tried to decide whether to call. She thought about her 11-minute run through the dark forest. about the cold coffee at the police precinct, about Lieutenant Phelps reading her notepad with actual attention, about Makeley in the forest, crouching beside her next to the fallen Douglas fir, looking at the compression marks her knees had left in the dirt. She thought about a deaf nurse who had gone for a run at midnight because she couldn't sleep, because a clinical director had handed her a performance review designed to diminish her, and she'd needed to move through something physical before she could think clearly again. She was still sitting with that when her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen, unknown number. She stared at it. She showed it to Torres, who was on her radio immediately. The phone vibrated again. Not a call. A text. She looked at Torres, who gave her a short nod. She opened it. The message was 4 words. "We know where you are." And then, 3 seconds later, a second message from the same number, a photograph. She recognized it before she fully processed what she was looking at. Angle, the setting, the lighting. It was the conference room she was sitting in right now. The photograph had been taken through the window, from outside. Torres moved before Maya had finished processing what she was looking at. The radio was already in Torres's hand, and she was at the door in 2 steps, speaking low and fast into the mouthpiece, her free hand making a sharp backward gesture at Maya that meant stay down in any language. Maya understood it, and she dropped below the level of the window, not because she was told to, but because it was the correct response, and her body knew that before her mind caught up. Pressed her back against the wall beneath the window and sat on the floor, and held the phone and looked at the photograph again. The angle was from outside, looking in. The window was on the east face of the building, 2nd floor. The photograph was clear enough that she could see herself in it, her profile, the notepad on the table, Torres' shoulder at the edge of the frame. It had been taken within the last 30 minutes because Torres had only been sitting across from her for 25. Someone had been outside this building, watching this specific window, long enough to take a photograph and send it, which meant they had known she was here before she arrived. Or they had followed her here. Or, and this was the version that sat worst, they had someone inside the federal field office who had relayed her location. She did not let herself sit with that last possibility for more than 10 seconds, because sitting with it wasn't useful right now. Moving was useful. She texted Makeley, photo sent to my phone from unknown number. Taken from outside east window, 2nd floor, within last 30 minutes. Torres is responding, I'm on the floor. His response came in 40 seconds. Stay on the floor. Don't move rooms without an escort. We're pulling exterior camera feeds now. The building went into a different kind of motion. She could feel it even from the floor vibrations through the carpet, the rhythm of people moving with urgency in corridors, the particular frequency of a space that had shifted from operational to defensive. 3 agents she hadn't met came through the conference room door in quick sequence. One positioned himself at the window with his back to the wall, angled to see the exterior without being directly visible. The other 2 stayed with Maya. Torres came back in 4 minutes. Crouched down to Maya's level, which Maya appreciated, it kept the communication direct instead of making her crane upward. Exterior cameras on the east face picked up movement 22 minutes ago, Torres said. 1 individual. Positioned in the parking structure across the street, 2nd level. Camera angle is bad, we got a partial. Male medium build, light jacket. She paused. He's gone now. He wanted us to know he was there. Torres nodded slowly. That's what it looks like. Why disruption? Move us. Make us pull resources from the arrest operations to deal with a surveillance threat here. Torres met her eyes. It's a distraction. The actual arrest operations are still active. Maya thought about that. A flush and follow, reoriented. Make the target move. The same logic applied to the federal office. She wrote, is Makeley still at the Haverstone operation? Coordinating from the field. Don't pull him back for this. What they want. Torres looked at her for a moment, then spoke briefly into her radio. The agent at the window said something short to the other 2. Torres helped Maya up from the floor and moved her out of the conference room, down a corridor away from the east face of the building, into an interior room with no windows, a smaller space, with a table and chairs and a wall-mounted neat screen that was just displaying a city map with several marked locations. She sat down. She was steady. She was also aware, in the way she was sometimes aware of things she'd rather not know about herself, that the steadiness was a managed condition rather than a natural one, that underneath it was a level of adrenaline response that she was controlling through sheer habituated practice. She looked at the city map and waited. 2:31 a.m. Makeley walked into the interior room and sat down across from her. He had been in the field, she could tell from the state of his jacket, which had a mud smear on the left sleeve and a darker stain near the cuff that she didn't ask about. put a tablet on the table between them. "We've made 7 arrests tonight," he said, including Stull, including 2 individuals at a safe house in the Millward district that we didn't know about until 2 hours ago. He tapped the tablet screen. The Millward location had communications equipment, financial records, and a secondary cache smaller than the Aldermore one, but positioned for close-range use. Maya looked at the screen. Photographs of the Millward location. She could see the organization of it, the way things were stored, labeled, arranged. She wrote, "The photograph sent to my phone. Who had my number?" Working through it, his jaw tightened slightly. "Your number was on a contact list recovered from Telt's apartment, along with your home address, your vehicle registration, which is interesting since you told me your car is in the shop, and the hospital schedule for the past 6 weeks." She looked at that for a moment. "They've been building a file on me since approximately 2 weeks after the forest incident. Maybe before if they connected your departure from the trail area that night to the subsequent federal response." He looked at her steadily. "Should know this. The notation on the list Torres told you about assess and redirect, we've now decoded what that protocol meant internally. In 2 previous cases where the network identified someone as a risk to operations, that protocol was carried out through third parties. In both cases, the individuals experienced events that were made to appear accidental." She held eye contact with him. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you," he said. "I'm telling you because you should understand the full picture." She picked up the pen. "I understand the full picture. I understood part of it when I saw my name on the list. What I want to know is whether the person who sent the photograph tonight is the same person who was supposed to execute the redirect protocol, possibly. Or the photograph was a message telling us they know about the arrests, that they have eyes on this location, and that they're not finished." He folded his hands. 7 people in custody tonight. We've been watching this network for 14 months. We know it has more members than 7. How many more? The full scope is still developing," she wrote. "Stull. What has he said?" "Nothing. He lawyered up within 4 minutes of the arrest, which tells you how prepared he was for this possibility." Makeley's voice was flat on that, not bitter, just accurate. "The documents his people tried to shred, they weren't fully destroyed. Our lab is reassembling them." "What kind of documents?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned the tablet around and showed her an image, a partially reassembled page, the reconstruction still incomplete but readable in sections. She leaned forward and read what was visible. It was a summary of operational intelligence gathered over a 12-month period. The format was formal, organized by date, by source, by category. Scanned down the visible sections. She stopped at a category heading that read Hospital Intelligence Haverstone Regional. Below it, in the fragmented text, she could read fragments of entries. Staff movements, admission pattern summaries, law enforcement contacts through the ER logged with dates and approximate times. And below that, a subsection, risk personnel. Her name was there, but it wasn't the first name on the subsection. Above hers at the top of the risk personnel list was a name she recognized but hadn't expected. Dr. Patricia Wemmer, Haverstone Regional's Chief of Emergency Medicine. She looked up at Mackley. "Wemmer is on the risk list?" She wrote it and pushed the notepad across. She flagged 3 of the ER admissions in the early stage of our investigation. Caught documentation inconsistency that suggested the patients were using false identities. She reported it through normal hospital channels. He paused. "It never reached us because whoever processed those reports at the administrative level, Stull's office, buried them." Maya sat back. Wemmer had seen it. More than a year ago, Wemmer had seen something wrong, had reported it correctly, and the report had been swallowed by the same administrative structure that had been feeding intelligence to the network. And Wemmer had never known. Does she know any of this? We contacted her tonight, as part of the Haverstone operation. He looked at something complicated in his expression. She's cooperating fully. She's also not handling it easily. Maya understood that. Finding out that your correct instincts had been right and suppressed, and that the suppression had protected people who were planning to hurt other people, that wasn't something you absorbed in one night. "Wemmer's the one who voted against my transfer," she wrote. "Stull told me the decision wasn't unanimous, that someone on the committee pushed back." Makeley read it. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that," he said. "She's trying to come and do the right thing from inside a system that was designed to make the right thing disappear." Maya looked at the notepad for a moment. "So have I. We just didn't know we were doing it in the same building." Quiet for a moment longer than usual. "Then get some sleep. There's a room here you can use. We're not finished tonight, but you need to be functional for what comes next." "What comes next?" "Tomorrow morning," he said, "you're going to help us build the case against Garrett Stull." She She slept 3 hours on a cot in a back room of the federal office, which was not comfortable, but was adequate. And when she woke up at 6 a.m., the building was still operating at the same compressed urgency as when she'd closed her eyes. She washed her face in a small bathroom, changed into a clean shirt that Torres had sourced from somewhere without explanation, and drank coffee that was better than the precincts and worse than anything she made at home. At 7:15 a.m., Makeley put a folder in front of her. The folder contained a reconstructed version of the shredded documents the lab had worked through the night. It wasn't complete, but it was enough. Enough to see the architecture of what Stahl had been doing for the past 2 years inside Haverstone Regional. He hadn't been running the operation. He wasn't a field operative or a planner or a weapons expert. He was exactly what he appeared to be, an administrator. But administration, in the right position, was worth more than most field operatives, because administration was invisible. Administration signed deactivation requests and buried incident reports and wrote performance reviews and moved personnel around and attended committee meetings and shaped the flow of information through an institution without anyone looking twice. Stahl had been an intelligence asset who never left his office building. She read through the reconstructed pages carefully. She made notes. She flagged 3 sections that contained references she could contextualize from her own experience at the hospital's specific procedures, specific corridors, success patterns that Stahl's summaries described inaccurately in ways that told her either he was working from secondhand information or he'd described things he understood poorly. In 2 of those cases, the inaccuracy was significant enough to matter. She wrote up her analysis in the notepad and handed it to Makeley. He read it with a focused attention she'd come to recognize as his actual working register, different from the controlled professional manner he wore in most interactions, more direct, less managed. This section, he said, pointing to one of her flagged passages. You're saying his description of the medication storage access protocol is wrong? Significantly wrong. He describes the pharmacy access as requiring 2-key authorization at all times. The policy. In practice, the overnight pharmacist has a standing single-key exception that's been informally approved for 4 years because the second key requirement was causing dispensing delays. It's not documented anywhere official. It's just something everyone who works nights knows. So if he was describing actual observed access rather than policy, he'd have the right procedure. Correct. Which means this section wasn't based on direct observation. Someone was feeding him policy documents rather than operational reality. His intelligence on this section is incomplete. Makeley looked at the page. It means there's a gap in what he passed on to the network. A gap they may have relied on. If their plan involved accessing medication storage and the trauma kits in the cache suggest medical operational capacity, they may have planned around a 2-key requirement that doesn't actually apply overnight. He had the radio in his hand before she'd finished writing the last sentence. The pharmacy revelation pulled 3 agents into a new work stream. Maya was asked to walk a federal evidence tech through everything she knew about Haverstone's actual overnight procedures, not the documented versions, but the lived operational reality that 4 years of night shifts had given her. She did this for 90 minutes in a patient, precise way, writing everything, accepting follow-up questions, going back to add detail when the tech flagged something she'd skipped past. She was finishing the last section of that when Torres came to the doorway with an expression that had information in it. Stahl's attorney made a filing this morning, Torres said. A motion challenging the evidentiary basis for the arrest. I looked at her. It's standard procedure, his attorney is competent. But the motion specifically argues that the initial investigation trigger the forest incident constituted an improper civilian involvement that tainted the chain of evidence. Torres's expression was neutral but careful. He's arguing that your identification of the cache location was obtained under irregular circumstances, and that evidence discovered as a result should be excluded. Maya put the pen down. She looked at the wall for a moment. Then she picked the pen back up and wrote, "That argument requires establishing that my involvement was procedurally irregular." Was it? Makeley followed protocol in bringing you as a civilian consultant. The authorization was solid. Torres sat down. The argument probably won't succeed. Going to generate coverage. Public coverage. The motion was filed publicly, which means it's going to be in the news today. And the narrative will be that the investigation was compromised by a deaf nurse who stumbled into the forest. Torres didn't answer, which was its own answer. Maya thought about that. She thought about it with the particular clarity of someone who had spent 4 years being told that the way she moved through the world created problems for institutions, that her presence in certain contexts was procedurally complicated, That accommodation was a form of liability. She thought about Voss and his careful loud register and his arms crossed in the conference room. She thought about Stull and his flat tone of administrative necessity. She wrote, "What does Makeley need from me to make the chain of evidence bulletproof?" Torres studied her. "Your full statement on the record, in a format that can be used in federal proceedings. Then set it up today. It'll take several hours." "I have several hours." Torres looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "There's something else you should know. Stull's attorney is going to argue that your transfer to wound care was legitimate, that it was a clinical decision made before the investigation became relevant to you. Voss will probably be called to support that." Voss wasn't connected to the network. No. But his performance review gave Stull's actions cover. Legitimate documentation of a personnel decision that happened to have the effect of moving you away from areas of the building relevant to the investigation. Torres folded her hands. "They're going to use your own personnel file to argue that you're an unreliable witness." Maya looked at the table. She had 4 years of documentation in that file. 4 years of shift reports and patient outcomes and incident logs and committee submissions. She had never had an adverse patient event. She had filed 3 separate process improvement reports that had been implemented. She had covered 7 different attending physicians without complaint. She also had a performance review that described her as a communication liability and a transfer order that said the current arrangement wasn't working. And she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had been in this position before in a different form, that the review and the transfer were the things that would get quoted. She picked up the pen. "I want my full personnel file reviewed by federal counsel. Every notation, every outcome record, every report I filed. Not just the review, we can do that. And I want Wemmer's testimony included. She flagged the inconsistencies over a year ago. That predates my involvement. That's not tainted by anything." Torres's expression shifted slightly. "It's a good argument." "It's not an argument," Maya wrote. "Truth. Wemmer saw something real and reported it through the right channels, and someone made it disappear. That's not my testimony. That's institutional record." Torres stood. "I'll tell Makeley." "Tell him something else," Maya wrote, and held the notepad up so Torres could read it before she left the doorway. "Stull's attorney is using my file to make me small. Make sure Makeley understands that the same file also shows what happens when someone tries to make the truth disappear by moving the person who found it. That argument works both directions." Torres read it. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that direction. She left. The formal statement took 4 hours. Maya sat with a federal recorder and a prosecutor named Adler, a compact, precise woman who asked questions like she was building a structure rather than gathering information, and walked through every event from the night on the Ridgeback Trail to the photograph on her phone, in sequence, with dates and times where she had them and honest uncertainty where she didn't. Adler pushed back on 3 points, not aggressively but specifically, asking her to distinguish between what she'd directly observed and what she'd inferred. Maya made the distinctions clearly, because the ability to separate observation from interpretation was something she'd been trained to do and had never stopped doing. When it was finished, Adler looked at her notes and said, "You're a very precise witness." Maya wrote, "I've had to be." Adler looked at that for a moment. Then, "Your military records came through this morning." "The Joint Special Operations attachment," Maya nodded. "Classification level on some of those records means we can't use them directly in open proceedings. But we can use them to contextualize your training and experience in a way that supports your credibility as an observer." Adler looked at her across the table. "The defense is going to try to paint you as an untrained civilian who misread what she saw. Your record makes that argument very difficult to sustain. That's why I authorized the release," Maya wrote. Adler nodded once, closed her folder, and left. Makeley came in 20 minutes later. He sat down and looked at her with the look of someone who had been awake for over 20 hours and was running on determination and bad coffee and the specific, driven energy of a case that was moving. "Stull's attorney filed a second motion this afternoon," he said. "In the second one, he argues that the network you helped us identify isn't what we've characterized it as, that it's a private security contractor operation that was conducting lawful surveillance of federal personnel under a separate authorization that was never disclosed to the task force." She looked at him. "It's a creative argument," he said. "It won't hold. But it tells us something. Stull has someone else's documentation. Someone provided him with cover paperwork, which means there's a layer above Stull that we haven't fully identified yet. That's what the photograph was about," she wrote. "Not intimidation. Information. They were telling you they still have capacity, that there are people you haven't arrested yet. Yes. How many? We don't know. He said it plainly, without the managed quality that usually accompanied information he was holding back. Honest uncertainty, not protected detail. The network was compartmentalized. Telt knows his section. Stull knows his section. The people at the Millward location knew their section. Full visibility of the structure is something we're still building. The layer above Stull, do you have anything on it? He looked at the table for a moment. Then he picked up the tablet and showed her a photograph. A man late 50s. Photograph from a distance, exiting what looked like a private parking structure. The photograph had a timestamp, 2 hours ago. This man's name is Dennis Farwell, Makeley said. He's a private security and intelligence consultant who operates through a series of corporate entities in 4 states. 3 years ago, he was investigated for contract fraud by a different federal agency, and the case was dropped. We're looking at why. Now, he looked up. He appeared on the edge of Telt's decoded communications, not named directly, referenced by a designation, and 2 hours ago, he was photographed exiting a parking structure 6 blocks from Haverstone Regional Medical Center. Maya looked at the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. Something was working in the back of her mind, the same pattern recognition that had stopped her on the Ridgeback Trail when the lights were wrong, that had registered Voss's posture in the corridor reflection, that had flagged the woman in the cafeteria. She looked at the photograph and let the recognition come instead of pushing toward it. She wrote, "The parking structure 6 blocks from Haverstone. Is that the one on Pelham Street?" Makeley checked something on his tablet. Yes. The Pelham structure connects underground to the Delmer Street retail complex. The retail complex has a service corridor that connects to the Haverstone loading dock. She wrote quickly, keeping the pen moving. It's a maintenance routing the hospital outsourced loading dock operations to a facilities contractor. Contractors' vehicles use that service corridor twice a day. It's not a public access route, but if you knew it existed, someone with access to the facilities operation schedule would know. The facilities worker I flagged, the one you found with Telt, Makeley was already standing. If Farwell is using the service corridor, she wrote, the pen moving faster now, is contact inside the facility's contractor operation, which means he's had a physical access route to Haverstone that bypasses the keycard system entirely. He had the radio in his hand. Get me the facility's contractor's employee records. For the past 2 years, he said into the radio. And pull the loading dock camera feeds for the last 72 hours. He was moving toward the door, stopped and turned back. Stay here. She nodded. He left at a pace that was close to running. She sat alone in the interior room with the city map on the wall and her notepad on the table and the photograph of Dennis Farwell still on the tablet screen. She looked at his face, the unremarkable face of a man photographed from a distance, exiting a parking structure, looking at nothing in particular. She thought about the flush and follow operation, about the cache position for a rapid response interception, about a network that had been running for 3 years through compartmentalized sections, each one knowing only its own piece, the full architecture visible only from above. She thought about the fact that Stull had provided intelligence, and Telt had monitored the hospital, and the Millward location had stored secondary equipment, and the forest cache had been the operational resource, and none of those pieces, taken alone, would have revealed the shape of the whole thing. She had found the forest cache by accident, but the shape of the whole thing she had assembled, that here in this room from fragments and patterns, and the practiced habit of watching carefully in the dark. She was still sitting with that when her phone vibrated. Affected Makeley, or Torres, or another unknown number, another message designed to move pieces around. It was an internal hospital extension. She stared at it. She checked the number against the log in her phone, the call from 3 days ago, the one that had come from the administrative offices on the 5th floor, that had been followed by the attorney's text. The same extension. She showed it to the agent sitting by the door, a young man named Pruitt who had been there all evening, and who had her contact list for exactly this kind of situation. He photographed the screen and was on his radio immediately. The phone vibrated again. Text this time. She looked at the screen. It was not from an attorney. It was not from an unknown number. Text from Ms. Arden. This is Patricia Wemmer. I'm at the hospital. Something is wrong, and I don't know who to call. There's a man in the building I don't recognize, and he has a keycard, but it's not a hospital keycard, and he went into the pharmacy level 20 minutes ago and hasn't come out. Called security, and they told me to wait. I can't wait. Please. Maya stood up. Pruitt was already relaying the text into his radio when she held it up for him to read. She watched his face change as he processed it. She wrote on the notepad and held it up. The pharmacy. The overnight single-key exception. He knows about it now. Someone told him after I flagged it this morning. Pruitt spoke rapidly into his radio. She could see from his posture that the response on the other end was urgent. She grabbed the notepad and wrote one more thing and held it directly in front of Pruitt's face, so he couldn't look anywhere else. Wemmer is alone on that floor. If Farwell or anyone connected to him is in the pharmacy and realizes she called for help, she becomes a liability. Get someone there now. Pruitt was already moving to the door. Maya was right behind him. Mammy started. She wrote, moving, not stopping. I know that building. Every corridor, every access point, every door that doesn't lock right. You need me there. He looked at her for 1 second. Then he moved aside and let her through. They moved fast, and Maya moved with them. Pruitt had a vehicle at the curb. In under 90 seconds he'd called it, while they were still in the corridor. The drive to Haverstone Regional was 4 minutes at that hour. The streets mostly empty, and Maya used those 4 minutes to write on the notepad everything Pruitt needed to know about the hospital's layout that he wouldn't find on a floor plan. The pharmacy level was the 3rd floor. It was accessible by 2 elevators and a main stairwell at the building's center and a secondary stairwell at the northwest corner that most staff used for storage runs because it was wider. The pharmacy itself had a main entrance from the central corridor and a secondary dispensing window that opened into the inpatient nursing corridor, technically a pass-through, not a door, but wide enough for a person to get through if they needed to. The overhead lighting on the pharmacy level ran on a timer after midnight that dimmed the corridor lights to 4% unless triggered by motion sensors at the main elevator bank. She wrote all of this while the vehicle moved, and Pruitt read over her shoulder and relayed it into his radio. 2 other vehicles were already en route. Torres was coordinating from the federal office. Makeley was being pulled back from the Millward location, which was 7 minutes away. Pruitt looked at her when they pulled into the hospital's rear access lane. You stay behind the team. You don't go in front of anyone with a weapon. You understand? She nodded. I know my role, she wrote. I'm navigation, not engagement. Correct. He held her gaze for 1 second longer than necessary, making sure it had landed, and then they were moving. The hospital at 2 a.m. had the specific quiet of a building that was still fully functional, but running on its night skeleton. The emergency department had its own rhythm. The upper floors were slower, the corridors longer and dimmer, the staff fewer and more spread out. Maya moved through the back entrance behind Pruitt and a 2-agent team, past the overnight security desk where a guard was on his radio, looking confused and unsettled, and toward the main elevator bank. She pulled Pruitt's sleeve. He looked at her. She pointed at the elevator, then shook her head. Pointed at the northwest stairwell, he understood. The elevator call would register on the security board and potentially on whatever access Farwell had monitoring. Stairwell was camera dark in 2 of its 3 sections. She knew this because she had submitted a security assessment 18 months ago, noting the dead angles, which had also gone to Stull's administrative office and apparently nowhere else. Took the northwest stairwell. The 3rd floor corridor was dim. Motion sensor lighting clicked on 10 meters ahead of them in a slow wave as they moved, which was unavoidable, but the northwest approach put them at the service end of the corridor rather than the main approach. The pharmacy's secondary dispensing window was 12 meters to their right. The main pharmacy entrance was around the corner, at the corridor's midpoint. One of the agents held up a fist. Everyone stopped. Maya watched his profile. He was listening to something she couldn't hear, radio probably, or something from around the corner. After 3 seconds, he made a hand signal she recognized from a context she wasn't supposed to reference in polite company. Someone was moving inside the pharmacy. She touched Pruitt's arm and held up the notepad, dispensing window. If he's in the main pharmacy space, the window is behind him. Second approach. Pruitt looked at the window, a horizontal rectangle of reinforced glass set into the wall at chest height, the pass-through below it currently shut but not locked. He looked at her with a question in his expression that she answered by moving to the window herself, staying low, pressing her back to the wall beside it. She could feel the vibration of movement through the wall. Someone on the other side, moving between the dispensing stations. Not panicked movement, deliberate, methodical. The way someone moved when they were looking for something specific and knew approximately where it was. She thought about the cache's medical supplies, the organized trauma kits, someone with medical training on the operational team, the pharmacy level. She wrote fast and held it up for Pruitt. He's not here for disruption. He's here for specific medications, probably controlled substances with tactical medical application, ketamine, fentanyl, hemostatic compounds. Cache's medical supplies were field grade. He's resupplying or completing a kit that was already planned. Pruitt read it and moved his radio to his mouth. The dispensing window was the variable. If agents came through the main entrance, and Farwell had any situational awareness at all, which he did, or he wouldn't have lasted 3 years in this operation, he'd have a second before the approach reached him. The window would put someone behind him before that second expired. Maya looked at the window. She looked at Pruitt. He looked back at her, and his expression said absolutely not. She held up the notepad. I'm not going in. I'm going to open the pass-through so the window is accessible. That's it. He won't hear it if I do it during the entry. Pruitt's jaw worked for a moment. Then he held up 2 fingers and pointed at the main corner. 2 agents, main entrance, and held up 1 finger and pointed at the window position, then pointed at himself. She understood. He would take the window. She would open the pass-through on his signal, which would be a tap on her shoulder from the agent positioned next to her. She nodded. She pressed her palm flat against the pass-through latch. It was a lever mechanism, standard hospital dispensing design. She'd passed medications through it hundreds of times on night shifts, when the pharmacy was short-staffed and running pass-through fills. She knew exactly how much pressure it needed and in which direction, and she knew it didn't squeak because she'd oiled it herself 8 months ago after the latch started catching. Tap came on her shoulder. She pressed the latch and lifted the pass-through panel in one smooth motion. What happened on the other side of the wall happened in approximately 4 seconds, which is both a very short and a very long amount of time, depending on where you're standing. She didn't see it. She heard nothing. She never heard anything. She felt vibration through the wall, a significant one, the thudding impact of a physical confrontation, and then a second smaller vibration, and then stillness. Pruitt's face appeared at the dispensing window. He looked at her. He gave her a thumbs up. She pressed her back against the corridor wall and breathed through her nose for 3 slow counts and felt the adrenaline move through her like weather. Dennis Farwell was in custody at 2:26 a.m. He had not come quietly. She gathered this from the state of Pruitt's collar and the way one of the other agents was holding his wrist at an angle, suggesting a recent impact, but he was in custody. He had a bag with him that the evidence team processed on site. The bag contained exactly what she'd predicted, drawn medications in unlabeled syringes. two sealed pharmacy bottles with the labels partially removed, and a set of documents in a waterproof sleeve that the agents handled very carefully. Patricia Wemmer was in the corridor outside the pharmacy when Maya came around the corner. She was in her coat over surgical scrubs, which meant she'd either been called in or had never left, and she had the look of someone who had been standing very still for a long time managing something large. She saw Maya, and something in her face shifted, not relief exactly, but recognition. The recognition of one person seeing another person they'd been thinking about from a distance without knowing the full reason why. She said something. Maya read her lips. "You came." Maya nodded. Wemmer looked at her for a moment with the tired, unguarded expression of someone at the end of a very long night. Then she said, "He was in the controlled dispensing cabinet. He had a secondary key card, not a hospital card. I've never seen that access system before." Maya wrote it was a contractor access card from the facilities company that runs the loading dock. Cross-references to a building management system that predates the hospital's current security infrastructure. Wemmer read it. She looked up. "How long have you known about this?" "About the specific card since tonight. About something being wrong inside this building since the night I went into the forest." Wemmer absorbed that. She looked down the corridor, where agents were processing the pharmacy entrance, and then back at Maya. "I tried to report the admission inconsistencies 14 months ago," she said. 3 separate reports. "I know," Makeley told me. Stahl buried them. She watched the word land on Wemmer's face. Not surprise, something past surprise. The thing you felt when a suspicion you'd tried not to have turned out to be true. "I sat in meetings with that man," Wemmer said quietly. "Talked to him about protocol and accreditation and staffing ratios." She shook her head once, a small controlled motion. "I voted against your transfer. I want you to know that." Stahl told me. He said the decision wasn't unanimous. It wasn't close to unanimous. It was Voss pushing, and the committee going along because Voss is she stopped. Voss is Voss. He's been that way his whole career. He's not connected to any of this. He's just a man who looks at certain people and decides before he's looked properly. Maya looked at her steadily. "I know," she wrote. "That's almost its own problem." Wemmer looked at that. Then unexpectedly, she let out a short, exhausted half-law that had nothing happy in it. "Yes," she said, "it is." Makeley arrived at Haverstone at 2:41 a.m. By then Farwell was in a federal vehicle. The pharmacy had been sealed as an evidence scene, and Maya was sitting in the staff break room on the 3rd floor with a cup of tea that someone had made her without being asked, and that she was drinking without tasting. He sat across from her. He looked at the agent's reports on his tablet for 2 minutes without speaking, which she had learned was his way of making sure he had the complete picture before he opened his mouth. Then he looked up. "The documents in Farwell's bag," he said. "They're the piece we've been missing. They contain the full organizational map of the network, not the operational sections, not the compartmentalized pieces, but the administrative layer above Stull, the funding structure, the communication hierarchy, the cover entities." He set the tablet down. "Case. What was in that bag is the case." Maya held his gaze. "How many people?" "Total network. Preliminary count from the documents, 31 individuals across 4 states. We have 7 in custody. The documents give us the rest." He looked tired in the specific textured way of someone who had been working toward something for a long time and had just watched it arrive. 14 months of investigation. And a nurse who went for a run in the forest. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she wrote, "Don't do that." He looked at the notepad. "Do what?" "Make it a neat story. I went for a run. I saw something. A lot of people did a lot of work for 14 months that put everything in position for what I saw to matter. It's not a story about one person." He read it. He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "It's not." He picked up the tablet. But you're also the reason Wemmer is standing in that corridor instead of being a name in an incident report. And you're the reason we have Farwell's bag instead of an empty pharmacy and a clean access log. He stood. I'm not making it neat. I'm just telling you the truth. He left. She sat with her tea in the institutional quiet of the break room and let the night settle around her. Outside the window, Caldwell City's amber glow was beginning to lighten slightly at the eastern edge, not dawn yet, but the first suggestion of it, the sky going from black to a very dark blue in a band above the tree line. She thought about the Aldermore forest out there somewhere to the west, past the hospital's edge, past the parking lots and the service road, and the trails she ran at night. She thought about the fallen Douglas fir and the compression marks in the dirt and the cold, clean focus of moving through darkness towards something instead of away from it. She thought about her name, third on a printed list, and what redirect had been intended to mean, and the distance between what they'd planned for her and where she was sitting right now. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired and clear, which was its own kind of thing. The legal proceedings moved the way federal cases moved in a direction that was mostly invisible from the outside, then suddenly, comprehensively visible all at once. Garrett Stahl's attorney's motions were denied. Both of them. The second motion, the one arguing that the network was a licensed contractor operation, collapsed under the weight of Farwell's documents, which detailed in precise administrative language exactly what the operation was and what it had been doing, and bore no resemblance to a licensed contractor program of any kind. The judge denied it in 3 paragraphs that were notably short for a federal ruling, which legal observers noted was its own form of commentary. The evidentiary challenge related to Maya's civilian involvement was argued over 2 sessions and ultimately rejected on the grounds that her background, military special operations, medical attachment, 4 years of documented trauma nursing, specific chain of authorization that Makeley had followed in bringing her to the cache site was more than sufficient to establish her as a competent and credible civilian expert whose observations were properly obtained and appropriately weighted. Prosecution entered her full personnel file into evidence. Not just the performance review, everything. 4 years of shift reports, patient outcome records, 3 process improvement submissions, all implemented, 7 attending physicians covered, 0 adverse events attributable to communication barriers. The performance review was in there too, and it sat in context next to 4 years of contrary evidence in a way that said something about performance reviews that Maya didn't need to say herself. Voss was called to testify. He sat in the witness stand and described his concerns about trauma department communication efficiency in the measured professional language he'd always used, and the prosecutor asked him to identify a single adverse patient outcome in Maya Arden's 4-year record that had resulted from a communication failure. Couldn't. She wasn't in the courtroom for that session. She was told about it afterward by Adler, who described it in precise, unadorned language that didn't editorialize and didn't need to. Stahl was convicted on 4 counts: conspiracy, obstruction of a federal investigation, misuse of institutional authority to facilitate criminal operations, and destruction of evidence. The sentencing was 18 months out, pending the completion of connected proceedings, but the guidelines were clear, and the judge's comments during the verdict reading were not ambiguous. Helt received a separate conviction. The facilities worker, his name was Ray Grout, which somehow managed to be both ordinary and fitting, pleaded in exchange for full cooperation, which added substantially to the prosecution's evidence against the network's upper tiers. Farwell fought it the hardest and lost the most completely. His attorneys were skilled, and the proceedings were complex, but the documents in his bag were his own creation, organized with the meticulous detail of a man who had believed until the last moment that he would never be in a position where those documents were in anyone else's hands. They outlined his role in building and maintaining the network's administrative structure across 3 years with a clarity that made the prosecution's job, in Adler's words, almost straightforward. Almost. Dennis Farwell was convicted on 11 counts. He was 61 years old at the time of conviction. The sentence he received ensured that the distinction between his current age and his release date was not a meaningful one. Of the 31 individuals identified in his documents, 29 were prosecuted. 2 cooperated early enough to receive consideration. The others did not. 2 compromised task force agents, the ones Stull had been feeding information to, or rather the ones who had been feeding information through Stull, were the subject of a separate internal proceeding that was handled with the particular uncomfortable thoroughness that institutions applied to their own failures when the failures were too visible to manage quietly. Both were removed from service. One faced criminal charges. The other resigned before charges were filed, which did not prevent the charges from following him. Caldwell City Field Office issued a public statement acknowledging the scope of the investigation and the arrests. The statement was careful and formal and did not include much of what Maya knew to be true, which was appropriate federal statements never did, but it included enough that Caldwell City understood, at a general level, that something significant had been operating inside their city and that it was no longer operating. The local news coverage was extensive. Some of it was accurate. 3 weeks after the final arrest, Maya received a letter on federal letterhead requesting her presence at the Caldwell City Federal Building for a formal recognition ceremony. She read the letter twice. Then she put it on her kitchen table and made coffee and stood at her window looking at the city and thought about whether she wanted to go. She went. The room was a conference space on the 6th floor of the federal building, set up with chairs in rows and a small podium at the front, and a group of people that included Makeley and Torres and Adler and Pruitt and Wemmer, who was standing near the window in a blazer she looked slightly uncomfortable in, and Lieutenant Carey Phelps from the Caldwell PD, who had been the first person to actually listen to Maya at the precinct on that first night, and who had made the call that reached Makeley. There were also 3 people Maya didn't know, federal officials of some rank. She gathered from the way the room oriented around them, and a group of agents she recognized from the federal field office, and 2 journalists with press credentials who were sitting in the back. The senior federal official who spoke was a woman named Regional Director Cassandra Holst, who was measured and specific in a way Maya appreciated. She described the investigation, the arrests, the scope of the network, and the circumstances of its disruption without embellishment or the kind of narrative tidying that made true things sound like they had been designed. She talked about Maya for 4 minutes. She talked about Wemmer for 2. She talked about Phelps for 1. And then she said something that Maya hadn't expected, which was, the hardest part of any investigation is the beginning. The moment when someone sees something wrong and has to decide whether it's worth the effort and the risk to say so. Most people, most of the time, decide it isn't, not because they're cowards, because institutions train people to doubt themselves, because systems reward those who conform and deplete those who question, because the people who speak up usually get very little for it, except the particular exhaustion of having tried. She paused. What happened in Caldwell is the exception that proves that rule, and we should be honest about the fact that it is an exception and think seriously about why. Maya sat in the front row and held her notepad in her lap and looked at the woman at the podium and felt something she hadn't anticipated, not pride exactly, but a kind of recognition. The recognition of being seen accurately, without the either-or of hero narrative or institutional liability. Just accurately. Holst presented her with a formal citation and shook her hand with a firm, direct grip and said, looking at her face, "Thank you for not going home." Maya wrote on the notepad and showed it to her. I tried to go home. Case wouldn't let me. Holst, read it. The corner of her mouth moved. That's the version of this story that's actually true, she said. After the ceremony, Wemmer found her in the corridor. They stood by the window at the end of the hall, the city visible below them in the late afternoon light, and Wemmer said, "I've been asked to lead a review committee for Haverstone's administrative structure. Full audit, reporting directly to the hospital board, not through the existing administrative chain." She looked at the city. "I want you on it." Maya looked at her. "I'm on transfer to wound care," she wrote. "Technically, the transfer has been rescinded, effective yesterday." Wemmer's tone was flat and factual in the way of someone delivering administrative information they consider overdue. The board voted unanimously. Your position in the trauma department is restored with a formal letter of record correction. She paused. The letter includes a notation that the performance review was not an accurate reflection of clinical performance and should not be considered in any future evaluations. Maya looked at the notepad. She looked at the city. She looked at Wemmer. "Voss," she wrote. "Voss is on a performance improvement plan of his own, which I understand is not exactly poetic justice, but is the appropriate process." Wemmer's expression said that she found it adequate without finding it satisfying. "He's not going anywhere immediately. That may change." Maya thought about that honestly. She thought about whether she needed Voss to be gone from Haverstone in order to go back to Haverstone herself. She found somewhat to her own surprise that she didn't. What she needed was something different and simpler: the record to be accurate. The 4 years of work to be recognized as what it was. Performance review to sit in context next to the actual evidence of her actual work. That had happened. Voss was Voss. He would continue to be Voss in ways that had nothing to do with her and would continue to affect other people in ways that she couldn't control. The world was full of Vosses. The answer to that wasn't to leave. The answer was to stay and be visible and make the record accurate every single time. She had learned that in a different kind of dark than a hospital corridor a long time ago, and she had carried it here without quite knowing she was carrying it. "Tell me about the committee," she wrote. Wemmer told her. It was a 6-month structured review of Haverstone's administrative access protocols, personnel management procedures, information security practices, and the specific institutional gaps that had allowed the network's embedded assets to operate undetected. Committee had subpoena power through the board and was required to produce a public report. Maya listened, read everything Wemmer said. She asked 3 specific questions, which Wemmer answered with the directness of someone who had been thinking about those same questions already. The end, Maya wrote, "I'll do it on one condition." Wemmer looked at her. "What condition?" "The report has to name the gaps plainly, not in administrative language that makes the problems sound like systems failures. In plain language that tells people what actually went wrong and why, and who was responsible. Institutions write reports that protect themselves. This one has to do the opposite." Wemmer looked at her for a moment. "That will make enemies. We already have enemies. At least these ones will be made in the right direction." Something moved across Wemmer's face, the exhausted, complicated expression of a person who had spent a long time trying to do the right thing inside an institution, and who had just heard someone else say, without apology, the thing that made doing the right thing actually mean something. "All right," Wemmer said. "Then that's what it'll do." Maya went back to the trauma department on a Monday morning in early spring. The shift started at 7, which meant she was there at 6:45, because she was always early. The locker room smelled the same. The nursing station had been rearranged slightly. Someone had moved the supply cart 3 feet to the left, which she noted without comment. The board had 4 patients already on it from the overnight, 2 of whom needed morning assessments. Russell Petit was at the station, finishing his overnight notes. He looked up when she came in. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then welcome back. She nodded. For what it's worth, he said, I should have done more. That night you came in from the forest. I should have made a bigger deal of it. Pulled out the notepad. You called. That was the right thing. I needed someone further up the chain, and I found them. Still, Russell. She wrote his name, and then you believed me enough to call. It's not nothing. That's actually what mattered. He looked at the notepad for a moment. He was a man who had been working the overnight shift in an emergency department for 11 years, which meant he'd seen the full range of what people were capable of in their worst moments. He didn't look like someone who needed reassurance often, but he looked like it had mattered to him to hear that. Okay, he said. He went back to his notes. She picked up the first chart on the board and read it. Committee report was released 4 months later. 47 pages. It named the administrative gaps in plain language. It identified the specific failure points in Haverstone's personnel and access management systems. Described, in accurate and unsparing terms, how those gaps had been exploited by whom and for how long. It included a section on the institutional culture of dismissal, the way that certain staff members' concerns and observations had been systematically deprioritized based on factors unrelated to the quality of those concerns, and it named this as structural problem rather than an individual failure. That section was the one that received the most coverage. It was also the section that Wemmer had pushed hardest for, and that had nearly been edited out twice by legal counsel before Wemmer had the conversation with the board that she described to Maya afterward as direct. The report generated coverage in 3 national outlets, 2 state regulatory reviews, and a formal inquiry from the hospital accreditation body that was ongoing. It generated discomfort in exactly the places discomfort was appropriate. It also generated something Maya hadn't expected: letters. She received them through the hospital's administrative office, forwarded from the federal contact information that had been included in a federal press release she hadn't written and didn't control. Letters from nurses, from deaf professionals in other fields, from people who had been told they were liabilities and had believed it, or had refused to believe it and paid for the refusal. She couldn't answer all of them. She answered the ones she could. One came from a nursing student at a university in another state who wrote that she was considering leaving the program because she'd been told repeatedly that her accommodation needs would make her a burden to any clinical team. She asked Maya if it was worth continuing. Maya wrote back. She wrote 3 paragraphs, which was more than she usually wrote to people she didn't know. She wrote about the difference between what institutions say about what's possible and what's actually possible. She wrote about the specific skill that came from being trained by necessity to watch carefully and think in systems and notice what other people stopped noticing because they'd gotten comfortable. She wrote, "The people who told you you'd be a burden were telling you about their own limitations, not yours. It's important to keep straight." She wasn't sure if that was helpful. It was the truest thing she could say. In June, the Aldermore Forest reopened to the public after a 3-month partial closure during the evidence processing period. Maya ran the Ridgeback Trail on a Wednesday evening after her shift. The weather was cool and clear, kind of evening where the city's ambient light barely reached the canopy and the trail was just a trail-packed dirt and exposed roots, and the faint smell of pine and last year's leaves composting under the new growth. She ran with her headlamp on, because there was no reason not to this time, no reason to hide her position or minimize her presence. She ran the 1.5 miles to the Douglas fir. It was still there, still down across the shoulder of the trail where it had fallen in the ice storm, bark beginning to soften with moisture and decay. The forest was already reclaiming its moss at the broken end, a line of shelf fungi along the underside, a small plant she couldn't identify growing from a crack in the bark. Stopped and looked at it. The place where she'd crouched behind it was indistinguishable from the surrounding trail now. Whatever compression marks her knees had left in the dirt were long gone. The fire access road to the north was visible as a faint gap in the tree line, nothing more. If you didn't know what had happened here, you would see a fallen tree and a forest trail and an ordinary evening. She stood there for a while. She wasn't given to sentiment, and she didn't stand there being sentimental. But there was something about the place, the specific ordinariness of it now, the way the forest had simply continued being a forest around the edges of what had happened here, that she needed to look at directly. She thought about what Holst had said at the ceremony. "Thank you for not going home." She thought about what that had actually meant in practice, not heroism, not the kind of courage that looked like anything from the outside, just the decision, made moment by moment over 3 days, to keep going when going was harder than stopping, to write the thing down when she couldn't say it, to find the next person with the right kind of authority when the person she'd reached wasn't enough, to not accept the performance review as the truth about herself when she knew, from 4 years of patient records and 7 covered attending physicians and 3 implemented process improvements, that it wasn't. That last part was the part no one talked about. People talked about courage like it was a quality you had or didn't have. They didn't talk about the infrastructure of it, the 4 years of careful documentation that made it possible to prove you were right when someone tried to make you wrong. The trained habit of separating observation from inference. Specific discipline of not letting other people's limited perception become your operating reality. She had built that infrastructure over a long time, in 2 different careers, in 2 different kinds of darkness. She hadn't built it in anticipation of this. She'd built it because it was what competence looked like when you'd learned that no one was going to hand you the benefit of the doubt, but it had been there when she needed it. She looked at the fallen tree one more time. Then she turned back toward the trail and ran the 1.5 miles home. Headlamp cutting a clean white circle ahead of her in the dark, a city's amber glow waiting at the tree line. The world around her entirely silent in the way it always was, not empty, but full of things she'd learned to read in other ways. There are people who go through their whole lives being told that the way they experience the world is a disadvantage. The way they communicate, the way they move, the way they think is slower or harder or less than the standards someone else decided. And sometimes those people start to believe it. Not all at once, it happens gradually, the way institutions erode things, through 100 small moments of being waved off or spoken over or handed a performance review that doesn't match reality. Maya Arden had never fully believed it, not because she was exceptional, but because she'd built the habit of checking the evidence. The evidence was in the patient records. The evidence was in the shift reports. The evidence was in the specific, accumulated weight of 4 years of showing up and doing the work correctly, and filing the reports and covering the shifts and noticing what other people stopped noticing. The evidence was in a weapons cache found in the Aldermore forest at 3 a.m. by a woman who had been told she was a liability. She had always known what she was capable of. She had just been waiting for the right moment to make everyone else catch up.